Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of the Your Neurodiverse Relationship podcast. I'm Jodi Carlton, your host, and I'm a neurodiverse relationship expert. But like so many of you, I've been on my own journey of discovering and understanding neurodiversity, both in my personal life with my family members and even myself, and professionally as a therapist and now relationship coach to people around the world. I'm often asked, can neurodiverse partner relationships actually work? And the answer is absolutely they can. Just like any relationship, there are core variables that influence whether or not you'll thrive as a couple. Neurodiverse relationships are no different, but they have the added layer of being neurodiverse, where one or both partners is neurodivergent. So this season, I've got a lineup of couples and partners who are in neurodiverse relationships that are working. They get real personal with me about the challenges they have faced and how they've overcome those challenges in their relationships. Let's get started. Hi, folks. In today's episode, I'm going to be chatting with New York Times international best-selling author J.D. Barker, who is a fiction author. He writes thrillers, suspense, horror, crime. J.D. is autistic, and he talks with me today about what that has been like for him because he actually started off in IT and tech, and so you're going to want to hear about that. He's also married and has a 7-year-old daughter, and today he shares how he and his wife have learned how to be a team in their relationship. She's neurotypical and he is autistic. This is an episode that I think a lot of you will relate to, especially my autistic folks. So let's jump right in.
So I was diagnosed at 22, but the first half of my life, I was a complete mess. I mean, essentially when I was a kid, I excelled at a lot of stuff. I was reading by the time I was 3. By the time I got into kindergarten, I had read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews. Math wasn't a problem, but I had zero social skills. And this was the 70s. They didn't really look for it. They didn't treat it. You were basically just a weird kid that they kind of put off in the corner, and everybody just sort of shunned you a little bit.
Yeah.
I grew up like that. I tried to fit in as much as I could, but typical story, if you're familiar with anybody that's autistic, people would crack a joke. I never got it. I would laugh, but always a half second behind everybody else, and only because everybody else was laughing. Eye contact for me was impossible. And it kind of dominated my life, but I had no idea that what it actually was. And I ended up getting a degree in finance, another one in business, and I had a job in the corporate world. And my boss, he really appreciated me. He felt I did a really good job, but I had a temper. People didn't want to do what I wanted to do or didn't understand what I was trying to do. It became a problem. So he sent me to anger management classes, and the therapist, about 20 minutes in, she stopped me and she's like, "Hey, have you ever been tested for autism?" And I had no idea what it was other than I had seen Rain Man. Like that was the extent of my exposure to it. But that was a real turning point in my life because she definitely pinpointed it. There was a ton of tests after that, and she narrowed in on Asperger's. And then once, we were able to get the diagnosis, then I basically started working towards, I don't like using the term fixing it because it's not necessarily what I did, but I was able to solve a lot of the issues. Like I learned how to make eye contact in conversations. I learned how to work with other people. And I started to focus on the benefits of it because it did offer a lot of things to me that I never really recognized before. I'd been very good at computer coding, and I didn't realize that was really because of Asperger's. When I wrote the first line of code, I basically had to understand how that would impact the last line of code. So this entire program would be up here. And for me, that was normal. But until I sat down with other programmers and talked to them, I didn't realize that's how not everybody does it that way. So yes, now I'm 53. So I've had 30 years of this in the rear view mirror. And it's been a life changer for me. I'm not sure where I would be today if I hadn't been diagnosed when I was.
Your story, you actually got a diagnosis a lot earlier than a lot of my clients do. I'm the same age as you. I'm 52. So grew up in that same era where I actually reference that a lot, that the only exposure our generation had to autism was Rain Man, like you said. And my knowledge and awareness of it, I mean, as a therapist, even in my training, there was no education about it. They didn't teach us about it. And then my daughter, who's now 21, was diagnosed with Asperger's when she was 5. And that's when it really got on my radar because she, like you were talking about being a mess, she had a lot of developmental delays. And then my son actually was diagnosed with ADHD in high school. And then I realized I'm ADHD, and we realized their dad is autistic and my mom is, it's like the whole family, which is something I wanted to ask you about too, because you got this diagnosis at 22, which a lot of my clients are not realizing they're autistic or neurodivergent in some way until one of their children or grandchildren is diagnosed and they're already in their 60s or 50s. And you talked about how having this diagnosis has really helped you embrace the skills, the benefits, but also understand some of the drawbacks. And a lot of people don't have that framework. And so when parents ask me, I don't know if I want to get a diagnosis for my kid, I'm like, I believe that you need to. I believe in that. But anyway, so for you, I'm curious, once you got that diagnosis, what kind of moments did you have? I mean, and what do you remember over the course of time realizing, oh, this is because of Asperger's is what it was called at the time?
Well, yeah, the thing is when you're autistic, solving puzzles is another big thing, at least for me. So this became another puzzle that I had to solve. So then I
Mhm.
immediately went down the rabbit hole of just reading every piece of material I could get, watching every show, documentary, and anything I could absorb on it. And I just, so many different things resonated. There were so many aha moments. Oh, that's
Mm.
why. And every time one of those things clicked, it allowed me to make adjustments in my own life and my behavior and kind of adapt for
Mhm.
it. You brought up kids. I've got a 7-year-old daughter now. From what I've read, it's a lot less, like it's hereditary, but it's a lot less likely to get passed down to girls versus boys. I think it's a 5-to-1 ratio. But I was watching from the beginning, and I started seeing little things. And at first, I told myself, no, I'm just being a little paranoid about it. But no, there were definite signs of it. We finally had my daughter tested over the summer, and she did get a diagnosis very similar to my own. But the good news is that at that age, now we're able to basically work that into her education,
Right.
and treatment. And she's very different from me in a lot of different ways. I mean, she has zero problems with social skills. She's not afraid of people at all. She will speak her mind. Where she's having trouble is in reading. She does
Mhm.
something that I've been told is called cluttering. And I don't know if that's the technical term for it, but essentially, like if somebody asks me a question, 3 to 5 different responses to that question will pop into my head all at the same time. And when I try to verbalize them, a lot of times those 3 to 5 explanations or answers all kind of get jumbled together and come out of my mouth as just a giant word vomit.
Right.
And that was one of the things that I saw happening with her. I could see her, wanting to speak. I could see her getting overloaded, especially when she was excited, and the sentences coming out jumbled.
Mm.
And because it didn't happen to me, because I understood it, I was able to help her with it and kind of help her slow down. And she's in therapy for that, and she's way better off than I was at that age, and I barely spoke to anybody.
Yeah, I would say that my daughter having that early diagnosis has been hugely impactful for her because we got a lot of early intervention. She did a word salad type of thing early on, like what you just mentioned, and so we were able to get her into speech and help her start getting that language organized. And I agree that the more we're able to get those interventions, and interventions kind of I don't know, like you said, it's not about really fixing it, but it's more about understanding it, and then where there are challenges, executive dysfunctions, that kind of thing, at least helping this younger generation, and but also people our age who are now understanding it more and recognizing it more, and even sensory processing and learning how to regulate our sense systems is so important. It's just so valuable to know, to know and to have the awareness, the framework there. So I know I wanna talk what the people that I work with. So my people who are listening to this podcast and the people that watch my videos and my clientele are all trying to understand what neurodivergence is and what autism is and how it impacts how we're different from one another in ways that are really beneficial and how it can impact us in ways that are difficult, especially in our relationships. That's the gap that I realized needed to be filled. I started working with autistic parents and teenagers and young adults over 15 years ago. But then I started seeing a huge gap in adults and in interpersonal relationships. And so that's a lot of the people who are listening to this are here to help understand and get more clarity about autism and how it looks in adults. You mentioned your daughter and the ratio of diagnosis. Some of that's because we don't identify autism in girls and women because a lot of that criteria has been established or from boys. And so it does look different a lot of times. But each person with autism also has a totally different set of traits. So as far as these listeners, they're going to be interested in you wanted to talk about creativity, and I'm excited to talk to you about that because I want to share some things about my own children and their creativity. How do you see as an adult, you're in your 50s, this is a stage of life where we really start to look back at our life and go, what has impacted me the most and what do I want out of my future? How do you see autism really influencing you as you've developed, as you've gone through your years? You've become an author that's a successful author. You've got a daughter. You're married.
Yeah. Yeah. We just had our
Yes.
10-year anniversary in February.
Okay. Yeah. So how do you see autism as influencing and affecting all of those areas of your life? And start wherever you want. I don't have a pick one.
Well, with the marriage, my wife and I, we had a very candid conversation about it early on, because it's one of those things, like I could go out on a date back then, but in a lot of ways, I'm playing a part almost. It's almost like being an actor. I could be in a social situation. I could be the person I need to be for X number of hours, but then I need to stop. I need to shut down. I need to recharge the batteries. And when you're dating, just dating people in general, like it's easy enough to pull that off. But when you're with somebody 24/7, you can't keep that switch flipped to on all the time. So at one point we sat down, we had a very candid conversation. I explained about autism and where I was in that. And she was extremely understanding. I think it scared her a little bit at the beginning, but we were able to kind of hash out the good and the bad of it. And she's been a huge champion of mine. I mean, at the time I was working in the corporate world, I was successful. I was doing very well. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. I had a really good salary. I had a nice house, cars, boat, basically everything you're supposed to have at that particular age. But I hated it. I would come home at night and I would write fiction. That was my go-to. I loved doing that. And one day she pulled me aside and she said, well, why aren't you doing that full time if that's what you like? Because I hated the corporate job. And those are the kind of things that that honestly never even occurred to me as an option, because I was doing what I was told I was supposed to do. I was playing that part of the chief compliance officer. But, so she from the get-go has been a champion of mine, back to just to get me to the point where I could become a professional writer. She came up with this crazy plan. We essentially sold everything that we owned in Florida. That's where we were at the time, in Palm Beach. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, and we rented out one side and lived in the other, and literally sold every possession we had and lived off of savings long enough for me to write that first book. These are all very scary decisions that I would have never been able to make on my own. I never would have followed through, on my own without having somebody like that behind me. And in today's world, I'm a New York Times bestselling author. I'm published in 150 different countries, a couple dozen different languages. I regularly speak to parents of autistic children and tell them my story, simply because if your kid is 2 years old and banging their head against the wall, they're not talking when they're supposed to be, or they're not walking yet, or whatever the issue is. For a parent hearing that on the end of all this, the flip side, their child can be successful if you tick the right boxes. That's a very important story to tell. And I try to get out there and talk to as many of them as I possibly can.
I think that is there's so many, what you just said is just packed full of so many nuggets there, because what you originally described in your relationship, a lot of people call that masking, with the role that you're playing that you talked about. And there's a very negative stereotype I've published some blog articles and videos about masking, and how I see masking is something we all do as a human race when we're playing a role in a specific situation. But for autistic individuals, it's less intuitive. It's less woven in. It's more of an intentional script that's being used. And you talked about how you knew you had to play that role, but it was exhausting for you. And it's great that you had that awareness, that framework of autism, that you were able to then talk to your wife about it, because a lot of people get into marriage, like you said, there's a difference between dating and being able then to retreat to yourself and recharge, and living with somebody 24/7. And a lot of partners to autistic individuals feel like there was a bait and switch. Like, I got this person and then we got married, and then I don't have that person's not there anymore. And so I think it's very important, like you just said, especially for young adults who are in that dating stage, or even older adults who are maybe divorced or widowed and they're dating again, to have these conversations early on, so that you can do the best as you can to anticipate what kind of difficulties there might be. So that was the first nugget that I'm like, yes, that is such a huge thing to communicate with a partner. But the other thing I heard, when you're talking about your wife encouraging you to step out of, would you call it your comfort zone? Was being in that corporate America, even though you didn't like it, was it comfortable because you could do it and you knew what to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think once I fall into, I mean, it was basically another pattern to me, and my entire life is ruled by patterns. So falling into that particular job, like everything fit, and
Yeah.
breaking from it. For me, something as simple as taking lunch at 11:40 instead of 12 o'clock, that's a problem. Normal people don't understand that, but I cannot just break from the norm like that. And my wife, she sort of humors that in me. Like we've got with our daughter now, we've got Amazon Alexas all over the house, and we've set reminders for certain things. Like bath time is at 6:30, so a reminder goes off. Bedtime, a reminder goes off. Not for me, like I don't necessarily need that anymore, but it helps with my daughter. It helps keep the rest of us on track. And for me, knowing that those things are out there, it takes the whole stress of it off, because otherwise something as simple as bath time for my daughter, if it's supposed to be 6:30 and 6:40 rolls around and she's not in that bathtub yet, that's my brain starts to fire off, and that's an issue. And my wife understands all that, and she's a saint for dealing with it.
So your wife is not autistic, ADHD. She would be considered neurotypical?
Yeah, she's very outnumbered now in our house.
Yeah, I should say so. So one of the things I want to point out that is sounds like you guys have really figured out is how to be a team and to be complementary in how you work together as partners. Whereas a lot of what I see with couples who are struggling so much, there's this antagonistic dynamic. I call it the boxing ring, where each person is basically jockeying for their own needs. What this person needs it this way, that person needs it that way. And instead of working together and saying, okay, how can we do this in a way that works for both of us, there's this antagonism. And the question often comes up. This podcast is going to be part of a series that I'm about to do about, can neurodiverse relationships work? Because I know they can. I've been working with couples for years, but I also see them spiraling and not working. My own marriage ended. We didn't know we didn't know he was autistic. We didn't know I was ADHD until after it was too late. And then we knew about our daughter, but we didn't even know about the hereditary aspect of it. It was just all still evolving. And
Mhm.
so a lot of marriages don't last. And so what can you say to our listeners in terms of how you and your wife have figured out how to work together as a team? What do you do? What's your strategies in communicating with each other and even figuring out what the priorities are about what are deal breakers, what you've got to have bath time or lunchtime at a specific time? How do you work together with her?
Well, I mean, initially, just because we knew about this going in, we both sat down with a therapist, because it's important, I think, to have that person, that knowledge base, not necessarily as a referee, but just somebody that can kind of point or keep the conversation going,
Mhm.
or get an actual dialogue going. And I think I've heard about couples like what you mentioned, and I think the bulk of them fail just because the communication isn't there. You end up aggravating each other, and before you know it, you're speaking less and less, and then that's what leads down that road to divorce. So my wife and I, what we end up doing is we haven't actually sat down with a therapist for probably 8 or 9 years at this point, because we kind of have the system down and in place. But we tend to approach any kind of your life decision as a team, like you mentioned. We'll sit down, like before I do something, before she does something, we'll sit down together and discuss it. And we recognize the differences. My approach is very different from her approach. And a lot of times we'll try and find something in the middle. Sometimes she helps me just to basically approach a situation as a quote unquote normal person might do. And those are the types of things I think a lot of people just don't do. And I think you absolutely have to. I mean, not even in this situation, but just in marriage in general, I think that's very important.
Oh yeah, it certainly is. And so what I'm hearing from you is that there's a safety in your relationship, a safety, a psychological and emotional safety to be who you are and for her to be who she is. And I think a lot of couples struggle with that because there's there's judgment, there's criticism, and it's not a safe environment for
Mhm.
people, for partners to work together as a team like that. So yeah, I mean, it's so beneficial for couples to hear how others are making it work. And I think one of the things that's the most beneficial about it is that the ones who are really, really struggling tend to think that everybody who's in a neurodiverse relationship will not make it, that they can't work. And it's helpful is kind of a weird word, but it's helpful for them to see that others are making it work, to help them to see why theirs is not. And maybe sometimes it's one partner or both partners who can't step out of that boxing ring and take the boxing gloves off. It's vulnerability. It's other stuff too. We bring all sorts of stuff, all sorts of baggage and things to our relationships too. So I appreciate you sharing about your family and your wife. And I know our listeners will be very interested in that. But let's talk about creativity, because I'm I'm very interested. It's so unusual for autistic individuals to make that switch that you made. So many of my clients are in finance, are in corporate, or they're in IT. They're in these high tech Silicon Valley rate of autism sky high. And so many of my clients are in those professions, but like you, they're not necessarily happy in those professions. They're good at what they do. They're good at the technical skills, but they're not good at the social skills, and they don't love what they do. And I know so many people, even some of my own family members. I have, like I said, I have a whole neurodivergent family tree, and some of my family members started their jobs out of college back in the 60s, 70s, 50s, and never ever left that job. I have engineers, we have engineers, and they stayed for life. And even when things weren't good, even when the demands of the job were unreasonable, even when there was a layoff, then they go back and go to a different part of the same company. So what you did is a pretty major leap. And it sounds like your wife, her support was huge. So what was that like for you? Because the autistic brain, from what I understand about it, needs that structure and certainty, and needs the lunch at 12:30 or whatever time it is, to take that structure out of your world, sell everything that you've got, move to Pittsburgh, a new town. What was that like for you? How did you cope with the stress of that?
I think a lot of it was because it was such a big thing. I think that actually pushed me to do it just a little bit more. I think careers like finance and IT, they all make sense for autistic people because they've got rules. I did a lot of computer programming in the IT world, and you've got a language you're dealing with, and A equals B equals C. Everything makes sense. So I think that's partly why we like to do that. I would come home. I've been writing for basically my entire life. I grew up without a television in the house. Like I said, I was reading very early. I started writing fiction at a very young age. It was always something I was told as a hobby, not something you could do as a career, which is why I ended up in the corporate world. But even while I was doing that job, as much as I hated the job, I would come home at night and I would write. I was working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, which essentially means publishers, agents, editors, they would send me books that were close to being done, but they needed some work. The author wasn't able to do it. So they would have somebody like me get involved. I ended up getting a lot of work because one of the superpowers, what my wife calls it, is a superpower that I could do as an author. I can read something that somebody else has written, and then I can mimic their voice. I basically pick up their vocabulary, their cadence, their writing style. I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family, and I wrote it in Bram Stoker's voice. I was able to do that because he has other written material out there, to the point where when it went to the editor changed a lot of the words in the language, and I was able to go back to him and say, no, Bram wouldn't use this word. He would use this word, and here's why. And feel free to check the other 4 or 5 books that he's got published out there, and you're going to find that I'm right. And it turned out I was right. So I ended up getting a lot of work because I could mimic other authors. But I did that for about 23 years. And over that time frame, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I wrote, but all had other people's names on the cover, which was kind of the catalyst for me. I felt everything had come to a head. Even though this plan that my wife came up with was so crazy and so out there, I was ready to make that change. And I approached it knowing that it was going to be extremely stressful and knowing that I would have to deal with all that. And I just tried to picture where we would be, on the flip side of it. Again, it was just another problem I had to solve. And the solution was me being a successful author. There wasn't a plan B for me. That was basically where we needed to be. I wasn't going to go back to the corporate world. So I had to get it done.
You had to solve the problem.
Right.
So you had enough data at that point. Basically, you had enough data to support that I can do this. I can do this as a career. I can do this for a living. And that mimicking, I know exactly what you're talking about. My daughter, who's autistic, we call her a little parrot, and we call them superpowers too. As a matter of fact, she's got that ability, auditory. She's got high degree of musical intelligence and can mimic what you're talking about. As a matter of fact, if she has a friend or is in class with someone who's got an accent that's different from ours, she'll start, not even realizing it, she'll start picking up the accent and will start sounding like somebody else. For her, she's in the process of studying Chinese and learning Chinese for a profession. And she's gotten the feedback that she's so good at the tones and mimicking the sounds, that her articulation, and I do think it's part of her autistic superpower, is one of the best in her cohort. But let's talk about the writing though, because there's creativity there. And so many people think of autistic individuals as these kind of drone-like robots that just are logic-based, like you said, rule-based, logic-based. And this is like a myth about autism, that there's not this ability for creativity. Autistics are just seen as just those logic-based engineers that are just going along with the scripts. But I know that I've seen a huge amount of creativity in autistic individuals. And when we look back through time, we see that a lot of our great artists that were probably autistic, Van Gogh and Beethoven and Mozart and some of the musical geniuses, but even the authors. And my own two children, you talk about writing as it was your way of just de-stressing. Both of my neurodivergent children write, and their imaginations. I'm ADHD, but I do not have that type of narrative storytelling ability that they have. They blow my mind what they can write and what they can produce. And I'm like, where does this come from? So talk to me about, you said you started writing when you were young, and they both did too. They both started writing, just even when they were 7 or 8 years old, just writing stories. And I was fascinated by their imaginations. So talk to me about that. I don't even know if it's something, it's just an innate ability for you.
No, I mean, for me, when I read a book, there's a pattern there. So I picked up on, this is where characters should be introduced. This is where a twist should happen. This needs to happen at this point. This needs to happen at this point, and this is how you wrap up the end of the book. Like there's a distinct pattern in every novel, and I was able to see that. And I read so much that I saw the same pattern basically repeat over and over again. Later, I learned that was a 3-act structure, and every book that I've written can be dropped into that, and it all fits. But I didn't see it up as that. I just saw the framework in my head. A book to me is very similar to writing computer code. I had mentioned when you write that first line of code, you need to understand how it's going to impact the last. Writing the first line of a book is no different. You have to understand how the book is going to end before you finish it up. And I think everything that falls in between is very similar to what we already talked about. It's basically me mimicking other people. So if I've got a book that's about a lawyer, I can become a lawyer to get that dialogue out there, to get that personality out there. I could become his 5-year-old child in that same story because I've been a 5-year-old child. I'm around them. And I remember, my memory is very good. It's not necessarily photographic. I've been told something circular memory. I have trouble processing time. A normal person, they remember something, but if you think of a straight line, the further they get away from that particular memory, it sort of fades in their head and it feels distant. For me, every memory is basically the same distance. So a conversation I had 5 years ago feels the same to me as a conversation 5 minutes ago. When something triggers that memory to come back, it feels to me as if it just happened. But that allows me to access certain memories at certain ages. Like when I play with my daughter, I can mimic a 7-year-old. I can play like a 7-year-old because I remember what it was like to be a 7-year-old as if it just happened to. So I'm able to pull from all of that in the actual writing of the books. And I think it all just kind of comes together in a perfect storm.
So your memories, I've actually had other autistic folks talk about it similarly. So your memories are almost like a database that's out there, and you can just open those files and access them. Whereas, like you said, for a neurotypical person, that those memories start to fade and really get corrupted over time. Whereas you can just pull that back up. And so, how do you research? Well, I have 2 questions. One is, how do you go about researching characters where you don't have firsthand experience? You've been a 5-year-old, but maybe you haven't been an attorney. How do you go about researching and learning how to get into that voice?
Either through television programs, books, a lot of research along those lines. Sometimes I'll actually meet the real life counterpart. I'll talk to attorneys, I'll talk to doctors, I'll talk to an astronaut. I've talked to serial killers. I wrote a series about a serial killer. So I met with
my daughter, that's her thing. She's a criminal justice major. She's all about the dark triad and the serial killers. She's gonna be fascinated. She's gonna go look that up now. But go ahead. Sorry I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's just another form of research. I just tried to fill in those blanks.
So so that's how you mimic the voice, and you've noticed, obviously, like you said, the pattern of the book, but also, I guess, to be a good author, to be a best-selling author, you also have to really recognize patterns in human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the speech pattern of a 5-year-old child is very different from a 50-year-old adult. And you have to be able to understand that, to be able to communicate it again. For me, when I'm writing it, it's almost like watching a movie. Researching the characters is my most important aspect of the whole thing. I basically have to create characters that are as real to me as real people before I start writing that first word. And then I just take them and I drop these real people into a scenario. And then I more or less watch it play out in my head as if I'm watching a movie, and I document it. So a lot of times characters won't do what I would necessarily want them to do, but I've learned to trust the character. Like this person might do something that I would never do in real life, but
Right.
they're the character. That's the person I'm following. So I let it play out that way. It's difficult to explain to somebody who hasn't actually been there, because I do see and hear the different people, and they are very real to me as I write them down. But at the same time, if I didn't have that level of happening, I don't think the books would be that good.
So these characters become like real entities for you. And as you're writing a book, that does make sense to me. A lot of people think of autistics as not really having high levels of emotional intelligence and really understanding how human beings, other people react and emotionally to situation. What's that been like for you to, because to be a best-selling author, you really have to understand how people would emotionally, psychologically, even logically respond to a situation. So is that something, has that been a skill that hasn't been difficult for you through writing or understanding emotions? And what do you have to share about that, about emotion?
It's honestly two different things for me, because I mentioned I have 2.5 degrees. That half degree is in psychology. Got halfway through a psychology degree before I started the writing thing full time. So I understand emotion. I understand people's reactions. I understand how somebody should react in a particular situation. So for me to put that down on paper is easy. Where it doesn't translate is to me as an individual, because I don't react that way. I don't process emotion that way. But for a character that I've created, I can, again, mimic that. I can make them seem real because I know how that person should respond in that situation.
Yes. Okay. So what advice do you have then for our listeners about, because what you just said is exactly what other people are experiencing. And it's what I hear. I know that I don't experience it that way, but a lot of our autistic listeners or people who have autistic partners, they're not recognizing that their own experience is different than the people around them. How do you go about relating to your wife, your daughter, your other family members, friends, when you see that their responses or their emotions are not what you're experiencing yourself? How do you go about navigating that?
My wife and I, over the years, have just gotten very good at talking about it. So if she sees me doing something that wouldn't be considered atypical, sometimes she'll raise her hand and she'll point it out to me, and we'll discuss it. We'll figure out why I'm reacting this particular way. Then we'll discuss how she would react under the same situation, which clues me in as to how a regular person, somebody who's non-autistic, would react. And then sometimes we find something in the middle. And it works both ways. Sometimes she'll do something and I'll raise my hand and say, "Hey, I think you're reacting this way because," and that communication, I think, is huge. And then the more I do it in life, I think you see a lot of the same pattern. And again, it's patterns. So you see a lot of those same patterns repeat themselves over and over again. They get easier to spot and then easier to deal with because it is repetitive.
And I want to emphasize that the reason this works for you and your wife is because you have this mutual regard for each other, this respect for each other, and neither one of you is trying to make the other one be different. Is not trying to make the other one be like yourselves, but you're recognizing we are different from each other, and let's talk about it. But you're still okay being you, and I'm still okay being me.
That part is, I don't mean to interrupt, but that part is so huge, because like initially, like, we tried to change me, and I say we tried to change me because it was a mutual decision. We tried to force me out of the rigid pattern of a schedule and all these different things. And then we saw the negatives of doing that, and we found some type of common ground in between. And vice versa. There's been issues with my wife where I pointed things out and said, I would handle it this way, and this is why I think this is better. And at the very beginning, we butted heads quite a bit over that sort of thing. Who's right and who is wrong? And then ultimately we decided neither of us were right or wrong. Everything is some kind of shade of gray in between. And we would, land on that, something that works for both of us instead of one.
I think a lot of couples do exactly that. People come to me even, and they're there to fix the autistic partner or to push them out of those traits. And do you mind sharing? You said you saw the negatives out of that. What are some of the negatives that come from trying to force an autistic person out of their natural hardwiring?
For me, let's take something as simple as having lunch at 12 o'clock every day. It's 12:05 rolled around and I haven't had lunch yet. It's almost like there's a voice in the back of my head that's saying, you have to have lunch, have to have lunch, have to have lunch. 12:10 rolls around, it's 10 minutes later, that voice gets louder. 20 minutes late, that voice gets really loud. And before you know it, it's screaming. And it gets to the point where like it is dominating every other thought in my head. And it doesn't, it's not just lunch. It's virtually anything that I have in front of me that's something that needs to be completed if I'm not getting it done when it's supposed to get done. So I think understanding that and being able to explain it to my wife, I think that's helped quite a bit because she sees that. She sees that. She'll even tell her daughter sometimes, Dada needs a couple of minutes because he's working on X, let him finish. That sort of thing. And we've seen it with my daughter too. She'll play a particular game, act out a certain storyline that she has in her head. If we interrupt her before she finishes, that's a problem for her. So we have to let her finish. And at the same time, we're teaching her how that's not always the same, with everybody. Like her friends may not want to finish up that particular scenario. And sometimes you do have to compromise. And she's starting to understand that too, which is something I never got at that age. I don't know if I had, I'm sure things would have been very different.
Yeah, I call that closing loops when there's that loop that's open that I haven't had lunch yet, and that loop's got to get closed, or anxiety levels start to increase, and then the nervous system gets activated, and then it just becomes that's where you can end up having a overload, like an overwhelming type of meltdown. I know we've definitely seen that with my daughter for sure. So, what advice do you have then for let's go back to the creativity in your career as an author. What advice do you have for couples and autistic individuals out there at any age who have they've got these and they're doing well in their jobs, but they also are not happy in their jobs and they have other types of creativities, whether it's art or writing or music. What's your advice to them as far as possibly transitioning over to something different?
I typically tell people that life is just too short. I was in my 40s when I pulled the trigger on this. I don't necessarily feel like that was too late because I spent those first 40 years honing the skill that got me to where I am today. If I had started writing as a full-time author back in my 20s, I don't know that I'd be as successful as I am today. So everything happens for a reason, but at the same time, you don't want to be 70 years old sitting in the rocking chair thinking, what if? You could pull that trigger, and I think everybody needs to, as scary as it may be. For an autistic person, I think just mapping it out, like we sat down, we came up with a plan. We knew we would be okay. We knew we would have savings. I could always get another job if I had to get another job. Knowing that those things are out there, it helps to get over those hurdles. But just talking it out, having a plan, I think is very important.
What else would you like to share? Yeah, this is a great conversation. I could probably talk to you for several hours. But what do you feel? What would you like to share with our listeners just about yourself, your life, relationships, creativity, anything goes?
I think when it comes to just autism in general, you just have to get out there and just really understand what you're dealing with. And again, it's another problem, right? It's like the more information you have, you can work towards a solution. And once you have that, for me, if a problem is just hanging over my head, that's when it's scary. But once I recognize it as a problem, as something that can be solved, then it just becomes a task. And then it's just a matter of what needs to happen in order to make it go away. And that could be the full scale issue of dealing with somebody in your life that's autistic, or it could be something as simple as bath time needs to be 6:30 at night.
Yeah. So again, back to problem solving. So one last thing, actually, that as you were talking, it came up for me that I want to circle back to. Like I said, my listeners are in relationships trying to figure out how to make them work. And as you were talking earlier about how you study your characters and you learn your characters and you learn how people would react or what they would say. What can you say to our autistic folks and their partners about how autistic individuals can use that skill to understand their family members and not get so locked into their own perspective and the way I would do things, what makes sense to me, but how can they learn to study their wives or their husbands or their children, their parents, whoever is in their life, to really understand they have a perspective too that's really different from mine.
Yes, it comes back to the communication thing, right? Ultimately, it's a problem you have to solve, but the other person who can help you solve it is literally sitting right there in front of you. You have a dialogue, and then you start to identify the variables related to that particular problem. And once you're able to establish, oh, okay, this problem exists because of A, B, and C, then you can start focusing on A, B, and C and solve those individually, together. But once you break it down and to get to those simple terms, I think pretty much anything is solvable.
And what would you say to the neurotypical partners in terms of what are the things that, what kind of traits or communication, but what sort of things has your wife brought to this relationship that has given you, basically allowed you to be you, be comfortable being you, and that's contributed to your marriage in a positive way?
Well, I think over time, just because she's been around me long enough, if something pops up that would have aggravated her to all in years back, now she's able to say, okay, I get it. That's why this is happening. And she'll maybe, if she has to, she may give it a minute to calm down before she actually addresses it, thinks it through on her side, rather than having that sometimes an explosive reaction that's just on the fly that either of us could do that ends up going down a very dark path. So sometimes just taking that little bit of a breather and understanding the other side of any situation is very helpful.
Yeah. A lot of neurotypical partners, well, actually, this happens for both, believe that it's their job to do more accommodating for their autistic partner. And then a lot of autistic partners believe they're working so much harder to be neurotypical. What's your perspective on that in a marriage?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's give and take. I think we're both working hard at both sides of it. And as long as you keep doing that, I don't think you'll fail.
Yeah, both sides. I agree. I totally agree. It's both sides. It's about both sides.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything you want to ask me or anything else you want to add?
No, I appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully this helps somebody that's out there listening.
Oh, I know it is. This is going to be great. You're definitely a success and an inspiration. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate you coming and speaking to me.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast so you won't miss any of these amazing interviews. And as always, if you're benefiting and enjoying this podcast, please give us a review. It really helps other people know that this podcast is really beneficial and worth listening to. Thanks for watching on YouTube or tuning in to your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to visit me online at jodicarlton.com for more resources. I have assessment quizzes, educational articles, courses, and more. And if you have any questions, just reach out to my team at gethelp@jodicarlton.com. Until next time.